In the late 1930s, as Europe inched toward total war, the Luftwaffe faced a problem it had not anticipated. Germany possessed excellent fighters and capable medium bombers, but it lacked something the Soviet Union already had in large numbers: a true, dedicated armored ground attack aircraft. The Red Army Air Force fielded the Il-2 Sturmovik, a heavily armored, low-flying, purpose-built tank destroyer that could survive extraordinary punishment while tearing apart enemy mechanized formations. German planners knew they had nothing comparable. The U-87 Stuka, though effective early in the war, was too slow, too fragile, and too vulnerable to fighters to fill that role in the long term. And so, in 1937, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or RLM, issued a formal requirement for a new class of aircraft, one that had never existed in the Luftwaffe before: a flying armored gun platform, specifically designed to hunt tanks at treetop height, shrug off ground fire, and operate under extreme battlefield conditions. Henschel, a company known primarily for locomotives and armored vehicles rather than fighters, stepped forward with a radical idea. The result would become the HS-129, a small, compact, brutally utilitarian machine built around a single purpose: to kill tanks. Its design philosophy was unlike anything else in the Luftwaffe. Instead of focusing on speed or agility, the aircraft was built as a flying armored box. The cockpit was surrounded by 75mm thick armor plates. The glass was billet-resistant, and the nose section was reinforced to withstand hits from machine guns and light cannons. The pilot was protected, but at a price. Visibility was terrible, the cockpit was cramped to the point of discomfort, and the aircraft felt more like an armored pillbox than a fighter. But the RLM believed this was acceptable. The aircraft wasn't supposed to dogfight. It was supposed to fly low, absorb punishment, and deliver lethal strikes against enemy armor. The first version, the HS-129A, flew in 1939, but it was an immediate disappointment. Its twin Argus AS-410 engines, chosen for political rather than performance reasons, were drastically underpowered. The aircraft struggled to take off, could barely stay airborne with full armor, and had such poor climb rate that operational units refused to accept it. Pilots joked it was the airplane that didn't want to fly. The Luftwaffe nearly canceled the project entirely, but the war on the Eastern Front, launched in June 1941, changed everything. Once facing thousands of Soviet tanks, Germany desperately needed a ground attack aircraft that could survive low-level combat. The HS-129 was suddenly valuable, if it could be fixed. The solution came from an unexpected place: France. After France's defeat in 1940, German engineers gained access to large stocks of captured Gnome-Rhone 14M radial engines. These engines were not powerful, but they were more reliable and significantly more suitable for the HS-129's weight and mission profile than the Argus engines. Henschel installed them on a redesigned variant, the HS-129B, which first flew in 1941. The difference was dramatic. The aircraft was still slow, still heavy, and still unforgiving to fly, but it finally had enough power to carry cannons, bombs, and anti-armor weaponry. Armed initially with MG-17 and MG-15-1 machine guns and cannons, then later with the formidable Mk-103 30mm cannon, the aircraft began performing the role it had been designed for: shredding Soviet armor from point-blank range. Luftwaffe pilots discovered that the HS-129B, when flown low over the battlefield, could deliver devastating firepower. Its cockpit armor allowed it to survive hits that would have destroyed a Stuka. By 1942, specialized variants appeared carrying the BK 3.7 37mm cannon, and in extremely limited numbers, the massive BK 75, a 75mm cannon salvaged from a Panzer IV, turned into one of the most powerful airborne anti-tank weapons of the war. This was the HS-129's short but intense golden age. On the Eastern Front, around Kharkov, Voronezh, and later Kursk, the aircraft earned a reputation among Soviet tank crews as a terrifying, low-flying predator. Soviet reports called it a black death from the treetops and the armored flea, reflecting its habit of appearing suddenly at extremely low altitude, firing its cannons at close range, then vanishing behind a tree line. Pilots of Schlachtgeschwader 1 and 2 recorded dozens of tank kills during the summer and autumn of 1942. In close support missions, the HS-129 was far more survivable than the Stuka, and its firepower was unmatched. For a brief moment, the Luftwaffe believed it had finally found its answer to the Il-2. But even in those early successes, cracks were visible. The HS-129's engines were weak and unreliable. Its controls were heavy, especially in tight turns. Its forward visibility, already limited by armor plating, was dangerously poor at high speed or against camouflaged ground targets. Many pilots compared the cockpit to flying a slit in a bunker. And worst of all, the aircraft was slow, painfully slow. With a maximum speed just over 400 kilometers per hour, it was defenseless against enemy fighters. On the Eastern Front, this weakness was masked because the Soviet Air Force in 1942 was still recovering from earlier losses. But the aircraft's design carried a fatal assumption that it would always operate with at least partial air superiority. That assumption would be shattered in 1943 when the Luftwaffe shifted the HS-129 to a new battlefield, one that American and British fighters ruled the sky. In Tunisia, the tank killer would meet opponents it could not outrun, outclimb, or outfight, and its limitations would prove fatal.
When the HS-129 finally reached frontline units in 1942, discovered that it had unintentionally created one of the most terrifying close support weapons of the war, at least under the right conditions. On the vast open plains of the Eastern Front, with their endless wheat fields, rolling steppes, and sparse tree lines, the HS-129 bediet. It was not fast enough to evade fighters, not agile enough to dogfight, and not powerful enough to climb quickly. But none of that mattered when the aircraft operated under the umbrella of German air superiority. In the summer and autumn of 1942, the Red Army was still rebuilding its air force, and many Soviet fighter regiments were equipped with outdated or depleted aircraft. In that environment, the HS-129 could behave like the brutal, armored predator it had been designed to be. German pilots quickly learned that the HS-129's intimidating silhouette and low-roaring approach created psychological shock among Soviet tank crews. The aircraft flew so low, often just 10 to 20 meters above the ground, that its engines kicked up dust and its cannons fired at angles almost parallel to the earth. The thick armor plating around the cockpit kept pilots alive even when their aircraft were riddled with machine gun fire. Soviet ground troops called it the Linkaubok-Typ, the armored hyena, because it seemed to lurk just above the grass, swooping into Maul tanks whose turrets could not turn fast enough to track it. Armed with the Mk-103, 30mm anti-tank cannon, the HS-129 became a genuine tank destroyer. The Mk-103 fired armor-piercing rounds at extremely high velocity, capable of penetrating the sides or rear of T-34s and killing lighter Soviet vehicles outright. Schlachtgeschwader 1 and Schlachtgeschwader 2 recorded significant tank kills during 1942-43 operations around Voronezh, Kharkov, and in the early phases of the Kursk campaign. Combat reports from Dritte Schuga-1 tell of HS-129 knocking out entire platoons of Soviet armor in a single mission, especially when attacking from the flanks while German panzer divisions engaged from the front. In these ideal circumstances, the aircraft was devastating. Die Luftwaffe quickly sought to enhance this lethality. Engineers mounted the BK-37, the 37mm anti-tank cannon adapted from the U-87-1 configuration. Later, in a feat of desperation and improvisation, the Luftwaffe installed the massive BK-75, a 75mm gun taken from the Panzer IV KWK 40L46 into the HS-129-B3 variant. This monstrous weapon turned the aircraft into a flying tank destroyer unlike anything else in the world. Though only a handful of these B3 models saw combat, their sheer firepower became legendary. Pilots reported that a single hit from the BK-75 could obliterate a T-34 or KV-1. Soviet tank crews feared these rare aircraft so intensely that some reported withdrawing temporarily when they believed its 75mm armed HS-129 was operating nearby. But even as the aircraft's fearsome reputation masked severe structural flaws, the aircraft's basic design had never been truly fixed. It had simply been adapted to work well enough. The cockpit remained cramped and difficult to escape during emergencies. The engines, French-built Nomron radials, were reliable by standards of 1930s technology, but underpowered for the heavy armor and cannon the HS 129 carried. Pilots had to manage engine temperatures constantly, especially during summer operations. The aircraft's slow speed, hovering just above 400 kilometers per hour, made it vulnerable even to older Soviet fighters like the LAGG-3 or I-15-3 if they managed to intercept it during a climb-out. When Soviet air power surged in late 1942 and early 1943, the HS 129's survivability began to erode. Units reported increasing losses, particularly when German fighter cover was thin. But even as the aircraft's weaknesses became obvious, the Luftwaffe had no choice but to continue using it. On the Eastern Front, the HS 129 remained valuable because the Luftwaffe could still provide at least intermittent air superiority with Bf-109s and Fw-190s. As long as these fighters kept Soviet interceptors busy, the HS 129 could do its deadly work. And for a short, intense period, roughly mid-1942 to mid-1943, the aircraft reached the height of its battlefield impact. It was feared, effective, and deeply respected by German ground commanders. This fleeting golden age created a dangerous illusion inside the Luftwaffe, the belief that the HS 129 was a universal tank killer capable of thriving anywhere. That illusion would be shattered when Germany transferred the aircraft to a completely different theater, Tunisia, where the rules of air warfare were nothing like those on the Eastern Front. In North Africa, the HS 129 would meet an enemy it was never designed to face, a coalition with overwhelming air superiority, faster fighters, and armored columns protected by aggressive and well-coordinated air cover. The aircraft that had terrorized Soviet tank crews would become helpless prey, and its pilots, hardened by Eastern Front success, would be stunned by how quickly their tank killer was reduced to a burning wreck in the desert.
When Germany decided in late 1942 to send the HS-129 to North Africa, Luftwaffe commanders believed they were reinforcing Rommel with one of the most feared anti-tank aircraft on the Eastern Front. 3rd Schlachg-1, experienced in low-level armored assault missions, was transferred to Tunisia, with the expectation that the HS-129 would claw back the initiative against growing Allied armor. But the men who had flown confidently over the Don and the Dnieper were about to confront a reality utterly different from anything they had experienced in the East. In Tunisia, the sky belonged to the Allies. The HS-129, an aircraft painfully dependent on clean airspace, would suddenly find itself hunted. The first warning signs came the moment the unit arrived. In the East, HS-129s operated out of large, relatively secure airfields. In Tunisia, they were forced onto rough, dusty forward strips, constantly threatened by Allied fighter bombers. Pilots soon discovered that even reaching altitude after takeoff was a risk. P-38 Lightnings of the 14th Fighter Group and Spitfire Mk-5s of the RAF patrolled aggressively, often sweeping the same airspace every hour. Logbooks from 3rd Schlachg-1 show repeated cancellations of sorties simply because enemy fighters patrolled the ingress routes. The HS-129's strengths, armor, firepower, the ability to fly low, were weaknesses in North Africa. Its engines overheated in desert heat, sand clogged intakes, and worst of all, its maximum speed of just over 400 kilometers per hour meant that any Allied fighter could outrun, outclimb, and outmaneuver it with ease. The terrain itself erased the advantages the aircraft had enjoyed on the Eastern Front. In Russia, the HS-129 could slip beneath tree lines, follow riverbanks, and vanish into landscape folds before Soviet fighters could intercept it. Tunisia offered nothing of the sort. It was open desert, broken only by rocky ridges. The moment an HS-129 lifted off, it was visible for miles, silhouetted against the sky with nowhere to hide. American and British fighters did not need to search, they simply waited.
Still, the Luftwaffe committed the aircraft, believing its firepower could blunt American Sherman columns advancing after Kasserine Pass. On paper, the plan was sound. HS-129s armed with Mk-103 cannons could penetrate the thinner side armor of the early M4 Sherman, just as they had pierced T-34 armor months earlier. But in practice, the aircraft never got close enough. The U.S. Army fought with a level of combined arms integration the HS-129 had rarely encountered. Shermans did not advance alone. They moved with M16 MGMC half-tracks bristling with quad 50-caliber guns, M3 half-tracks carrying infantry with additional 50 cals, and, crucially, continuous overhead protection from P-38s, P-40s, and Spitfires. The struggle became painfully obvious during one of the earliest large-scale engagements involving the HS-129, the fighting around Fayed Kasserine in February-March 1943. 3rd Schlachty 1 launched multiple low-level attack sorties against U.S. armored columns advancing near the Kasserine Pass. The aircraft flew at treetop height, just as in Russia, but instead of lumbering Soviet tanks protected by sporadic fighters, they encountered coordinated Allied responses. In one recorded case on 9 March 1943, a formation of HS-129s was bounced by P-38 Lightnings minutes after crossing the front line. 4 HS-129s were shot down almost instantly. The rest jettisoned their ordnance and fled barely above the desert floor. Not a single Sherman had been hit. The Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom had achieved success on the Eastern Front, were stunned at how quickly the tide turned. Air superiority mattered more than armor plating or cannon caliber. Even when the HS-129 managed to begin an attack run, Allied defenses shredded it. The quad 50 calibers of the M16 MGMC tore through its armor in short bursts. The aircraft's notorious blind spots, especially downward-forward visibility limited by thick armor plates, made target acquisition slower, forcing pilots to expose themselves longer to defensive fire. This was not Russia, where Soviet infantry often lacked heavy machine guns along armored columns. In Tunisia, every American convoy bristled with 50-caliber firepower that could chew through wings and ruptured fuel lines with terrifying speed. Luftwaffe maintenance units recorded another devastating problem. The Gnome engines hated desert conditions. Sand infiltration reduced power output and caused frequent overheating. Loss of even a small amount of power made the sluggish aircraft nearly unflyable. Pilots wrote that in Tunisia, the HS-129 felt like dragging a wagon through mud. If one engine died, something far more common in the desert, the aircraft usually crashed. As Allied control of the air tightened throughout March and April 1943, the Luftwaffe tried switching HS-129s to dawn and dusk operations. The move failed. P-38s, guided by radar and long-range patrol patterns, intercepted them anyway. RAF night fighters, even older Hurricanes, were fast enough to catch the Henschels when they attempted low-light missions. 3rd Schlachty 1's losses mounted. For every successful sortie where an HS-129 managed to claim a damaged or destroyed vehicle, 2 or 3 aircraft were lost. By April 1943, German pilots privately admitted what High Command refused to acknowledge. The HS-129 was completely mismatched for Tunisia. It needed air superiority to survive. It needed terrain to hide in. It needed weak air defenses. Tunisia offered none of these. Here, the HS-129's earlier reputation meant nothing. It was a slow, vulnerable, isolated intruder attempting to operate in an environment dominated by Allied fighters and aggressive combined arms tactics. The Eastern Front had given the HS-129 a brief golden moment. Tunisia would show that the aircraft's success was conditional, and those conditions no longer existed. The tank killer was now the one being hunted, and every sortie over the desert made that truth painfully clear. By the spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe's belief that the HS-129 could replicate its Eastern Front success in North Africa had collapsed under the weight of brutal, undeniable reality. On paper, the aircraft still carried fearsome credentials. Mk-103 cannons capable of piercing the side armor of early Shermans, reinforced cockpit plating thick enough to survive rifle-caliber hits, and low-level maneuverability that made Soviet tankers curse its name. But in Tunisia, none of those strengths mattered, because the aircraft's most critical weakness, its dependence on a friendly sky, was exposed in every sortie. The HS-129, once a predator, was now prey, and American armored formations, supported by a level of coordination the Luftwaffe had never encountered on the Eastern Front, simply rolled forward untouched. The core of the problem was that American armor did not operate alone. U.S. armored columns were mobile ecosystems of firepower, combining tanks, infantry, anti-aircraft guns, and air support in tight mutual support grids. The HS-129 relied on making rapid, low-altitude strikes, but American forces had layered defenses expressly designed to kill exactly that kind of low-flying threat. At the center of these defenses stood the M16 MGMC half-track, armed with a terrifying quad 50 caliber battery nicknamed the Meat Chopper. Against lightly armored Soviet columns, the HS-129 could attack with impunity. Against American formations bristling with 50s, the HS-129 entered a storm of fire so intense that pilots sometimes aborted without firing a shot. Combat reports from U.S. units in March 1943 describe HS-129's attempting approach runs only to be shredded at ranges under 800 meters. Gunners quickly learned that the Henschel's slow speed, just over 400 kilometers per hour, meant it lingered in the engagement envelope longer than any other Luftwaffe aircraft. One American gunner wrote that it was like shooting at a truck with wings. Even when the HS-129 managed to stabilize long enough to line up its Mk-103 cannon, its narrow forward view made target acquisition painfully slow. On the Eastern Front, that flaw had been tolerable. Against columns protected by multiple overlapping 50 caliber guns, it was suicide. And then came the fighters. The U.S. Army Air Forces and RAF maintained a constant presence over Tunisia, an oppressive aerial blanket that made every German takeoff a gamble. P-38 Lightnings were particularly lethal. Their long range, high speed, and excellent climb rate allowed them to intercept HS-129s before they even reached the front. The aircraft that had once terrified Soviet armored crews never got close to American tanks. German pilots, veterans of low-level Russian operations, wrote bitterly in their diaries, "We never saw the Sherman, only the Lightning." When P-40 Warhawks and Spitfire Mk-5s joined the hunt, the air around the HS-129 became a death trap. The disaster reached its peak during a series of engagements in late March and early April 1943. In one daylight operation near El Guettar, 3rd Schwarzgeschwader 1 attempted to strike American tanks supporting the 1st Infantry Division. The HS-129s descended to low altitude, just as doctrine demanded, but as they began their attack runs, 5 P-38s dove on them. 3 HS-129s were shot down within seconds. A 4th, hit by 50 caliber defensive fire, crashed short of the target. Not a single American vehicle was damaged. After-action Luftwaffe reports were blunt. Operations impossible without air superiority. The Luftwaffe tried shifting to dawn and dusk sorties, hoping to exploit low visibility. but the Allies were prepared for that too. RAF Spitfires flew flexible patrol schedules, and American radar-coordinated fighter sweeps repeatedly intercepted HS-129s at the worst possible time, during climb-out, when the aircraft was the slowest. Even the notoriously outdated Hurricane was fast enough to run down the beleaguered Henschel in the desert air. For every sortie the HS-129 survived, 2 more were canceled due to enemy fighter presence. Mechanical failures made the situation catastrophic. The desert was poison to the French-built Gnome-Rhone engines. Sand erosion reduced power output, clogged cooling systems, and caused overheating during the takeoff roll. When a unit is flying an aircraft already famous for underpowered engines, losing even a fraction of rated horsepower is a death sentence. Pilots recorded multiple fatal crashes after single-engine failures, a common occurrence in North Africa. By mid-April 1943, 3rd Schlottske 1 was effectively combat ineffective. Many aircraft were destroyed on the ground in Allied fighter bomb raids. Others were lost attempting to flee over dusty ridgelines, while P-38s and Spitfires pounced from above. The unit's operational strength dwindled until some days it could muster only 2 or 3 serviceable aircraft. Even then, commanders hesitated to deploy them. The loss rate had become unsustainable. The final blow came in late April and early May 1943 as Axis forces collapsed around Tunis. The remaining HS-129s attempted a handful of desperate sorties, but Allied air supremacy had reached total domination. U.S. and British fighters operated almost without opposition. German pilots, who once strafed Soviet tank columns with confidence, now found themselves dodging interceptors before they even reached the front line. The aircraft that had once terrified Soviet tankers never got close to American tanks. The aircraft that had once terrified Soviet tankers never got close to American tanks. The aircraft that had once terrified Soviet tankers never got close to American tanks. The aircraft that had once terrified Soviet tankers never got close to American tanks. The aircraft that had once terrified Soviet tankers never got close to American tanks. The aircraft that had once terrified Soviet tankers never got close to American tanks. When Tunisia fell on 13th May 1943, the Luftwaffe lost nearly all the HS-129s deployed to the theater. The aircraft's failure was undeniable. It had not been a universal tank killer. It had been a conditional weapon, lethal only when protected by fighters and favorable terrain. In North Africa, where the Allies owned the sky, the HS-129 was nothing more than a slow-moving target that never reached the tanks it was designed to destroy. The Luftwaffe had learned a brutal lesson. No amount of armor or firepower can save an aircraft when the enemy controls the air.
By the time the last pockets of Axis resistance collapsed in Tunisia in May 1943, the men of 3rd-SG-1 no longer harbored illusions about their aircraft. The HS-129, once celebrated on the Eastern Front as a rugged, low-flying beast capable of ripping through Soviet armor, had been exposed as utterly dependent on circumstances Germany could no longer provide. Its failures were not the result of pilot incompetence or tactical error. They were written into the aircraft's very design. The HS-129 had been engineered for a battlefield where Luftwaffe fighters kept the skies clean, where the terrain offered concealment, and where enemy armored units lacked heavy anti-air defenses. In Tunisia, none of those conditions existed. Slowly, painfully, Luftwaffe pilots realized the truth. The HS-129 was a tank killer that could not survive long enough to kill tanks. German pilots' testimonies after the campaign revealed a scale of disillusionment. Many had arrived from the Eastern Front with confidence, believing their aircraft could replicate earlier success. But as the sorties mounted and losses climbed, their tone shifted from optimism to resignation.
One pilot, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Stegmüller, later remarked, "In Russia, we hunted. In Tunisia, we were hunted." Another stated flatly, "The HS-129 needed the sky. In Africa, the sky belonged to the enemy." These were not exaggerations. For every tank the Henschel approached, Allied fighters shot down 2 or 3 aircraft before they even reached firing range. This reality forced a harsh reassessment within the Luftwaffe High Command. Internal reports acknowledged what pilots already knew. The aircraft's maximum speed, just over 400 kilometers per hour, was hopelessly inadequate against P-38s, P-40s, and Spitfires. Its underpowered engines turned desert takeoffs into dangerous gambles. Its armor cockpit, once praised for protecting against small arms fire, offered no defense against quad .50 caliber fire from American half-tracks. And its limited forward visibility, the result of thick armored plating, slowed down the very target acquisition it depended on for survival. In short, the aircraft designed to kill tanks was defeated by the very battlefield it was sent to dominate. German interrogations and after-action assessments reveal their shock at American combined arms doctrine. Luftwaffe pilots had expected to strike isolated armored columns, as they had on the Eastern Front. Instead, they found Shermans operating in tight symbiosis with motorized infantry, anti-aircraft platforms, and constant fighter cover. An American tank column was not a collection of targets. It was a moving fortress, protected from ground and air. Some pilots attempted low-altitude approaches using ravines or ridgelines, but the desert offered no concealment. Others tried high-speed dives, but the HS-129 simply lacked the acceleration. The aircraft never had a chance. When the remnants of 3rd-SG-1 surrendered or evacuated, they carried stories that circulated widely among other Luftwaffe units. Pilots described warning incoming replacements, "Do not fly the HS-129 without air superiority. You will not return." This was not cynicism, it was mathematical certainty. In Russia, the aircraft's losses were sustainable because the Soviets struggled to intercept it consistently. In Tunisia, Allied fighters covered every approach path, every airfield, every valley. They treated the desert sky like an enormous trap, and the HS-129 flew straight into it. The aircraft's fate after Tunisia reflects how thoroughly its weaknesses were exposed. Germany continued deploying HS-129s on the Eastern Front, where they still retained usefulness, but the Luftwaffe never again attempted to use them in a theater where the Allies controlled the air. The lesson was simple. The aircraft could only function if the Luftwaffe's fighter arm shielded it. By 1944, when Soviet fighter strength surged and the Western Allies dominated the skies over Europe, the HS-129's survivability declined everywhere. Even the monstrously armed HS-129B3 with the BK-7.5, a flying anti-tank gun with unprecedented firepower, proved irrelevant when enemy fighters could ambush it at will. The final judgment came not from Allied analysts, but from the very men who had flown the aircraft in both triumph and disaster. In post-war interviews, Luftwaffe pilots repeatedly described the HS-129 with a mix of admiration and bitterness. They respected the armor, they respected the firepower, they respected the bravery it demanded, but they all agreed on the same core truth: air superiority determines whether a tank killer lives or dies. The American and British fighter presence in Tunisia ensured the HS-129 died. One Luftwaffe pilot summed it up with brutal clarity: the HS-129 was a dagger. In Russia, the enemy exposed his throat. In Africa, he carried a shield. The shield was Allied air supremacy, American .50 caliber fire, and combined arms coordination that prevented German aircraft from even approaching a Sherman. In the end, the HS-129 became a symbol of a larger German failure: the inability to maintain air superiority as the war progressed. The aircraft that had once inspired fear among Soviet tank crews became an object lesson in the limits of specialized designs in modern warfare. It had been built to kill tanks, But the battlefield had changed faster than its designers ever imagined. Without the Luftwaffe's protection, the HS-129 was helpless. And in Tunisia, it learned that lesson the hard way.